Besides the chiefly line, of the Mackenzie cadet families who established themselves on the island of Lewis, the most significant were the Mackenzies of Kildun, descendants of the second Earl of Seaforth and staunch Jacobites. Kildun House was at Arnish, the promontory on the south side of Stornoway Bay. Following the example of their chief, the Mackenzies of Kildun were Roman Catholics, and as Jacobite exiles included the Jacobite spy, the Chevalier Mackenzie Douglas, and two Russian rear admirals, both called Thomas Mackenzie, who were father and son, the latter becoming commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy in Crimea, where he was responsible for the establishment of Sebastopol as the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. Kildun House no longer exists, having been burnt down in the 1970s, but this is the nearby monument to Prince Charlie, who visited when in hiding in 1746. And this is Alan Ramsay's portrait of the Prince, painted in better days at the height of his adulation in Edinburgh the previous year, when expectations were high. Colin Mackenzie of Kildun, who was the grandson of the second Earl of Seaforth, had retained close ties with the Jacobite community through his sister, who was the second wife of the 16th Clanranald chief, mother of MacDonald of Boisdale, and stepmother of old Clanranald of the 45. Colin had been one of the Mackenzie officers in the Jacobite army in the Rising of 1715. Most glamorously, his wife, Anna, Lady Kildun, sheltered the prince in the spring of 1746 in Kildun House, having made his way there after landing at Loch Seaforth in hiding from the government search party. The hospitable hostess received the prince enthusiastically, having a cow killed for him, for which she refused his offer of payment. It was a particularly welcome break for the fugitive, who at Kildun House was able to take off and have one of his companions dry his sodden shirt by the fireside. It is recorded that Lady Kildun was to assist the prince by giving him 2 pieces of meal, a wooden plate, a junt of butter betwixt 2 tardles of bread, brandy and sugar, from which they were later to concoct a jorum of steaming punch, which the prince was in the event forced to drink cold. Lady Kildun then advised him that his safety was best served by returning to Benbecula under the protection of her kinsman Clanranald, procuring a boat for him to cross Loch Stornoway before being escorted over the sea to Skye by Flora MacDonald. The 2 most remarkable Mackenzies to be associated with Lewis, however, were not clan chiefs, nor even lairds, but quite ordinary clansmen. Both these men had been schooled in Stornoway in the 18th century. Contrary to the perception about such a remote place, supposedly divorced from civilization, a perception in my experience prevalent as much today as it was then, both men were extremely well educated and should be celebrated as beacons of the Scottish Enlightenment, as much as any of their kinsmen residing in Edinburgh at the time. A descendant of George Mackenzie of Gruinard, and hence of the second Earl of Seaforth, Colonel Colin Mackenzie was the first Surveyor-General of India and a pioneer in the West of the study of Hindu culture. This is Colonel Colin by Thomas Hickey. He is accompanied in this portrait by his devoted Brahmin assistants. In the distance is the colossal Jain statue of Gometaswara in Mysore, which Mackenzie was the first to measure. Colin himself explained the origins of his interest in a letter to his friend, Sir Alexander Johnston. On the chief predisposing causes of a cause so foreign to the habits of military men, it were unnecessary for me to enlarge. I must, however, attribute some of the early seeds of passion for discovery and acquisition of knowledge and to ideas first implanted in my native isle. Indeed, to put his background in perspective, even Colin's kinsman, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the great Canadian explorer, who attended the same school in Stornoway just 11 years later, together with the latter's cousin Roderick, founded a library in the howling wilderness at their depot on Lake Athabasca on the Arctic Circle, for which reason it was dubbed the Athens of the North. At a time when historians have been criticised for whitewashing British colonial history, it is good to be able to illustrate the positive side of this family circle in this regard. Although a slave owner, and in many ways a man of his time, the last Lord Seaforth's commitment to the welfare of slaves and free people of colour as Governor of Barbados was a real personal crusade and went well beyond the call of duty, causing him enormous stress and difficulty with the white Barbadians. In successfully securing the Slaves Protection Act of 1805, this progressive piece of legislation allowed that, in Seaforth's words, the malicious and wilful murder of any fellow creature, whether it be a free person or a slave, ought to be punished by the death of the murderer. In the context of his contemporaries, this was highly progressive. One can detect the same tolerant trait in Francis's daughter Mary, the future Mrs. Stuart Mackenzie, who is favourably featured in William Dalrymple's excellent book White Moguls, which is about James Achilles Kirkpatrick, the British representative in Hyderabad, and his love affair with the beautiful Mogul princess Khair-un-Nissa. Having temporarily deserted her elderly admiral husband, the then Lady Hood went off on her own around India in the summer of 1813 with an express wish to meet Indian women of rank. Lady Hood was entranced by the sadness, beauty and intelligence of the widowed Khair-un-Nissa. The Indian princess in turn showed her affection for this aristocratic tomboy from the Isle of Lewis, as Dalrymple describes her, by personally making her a dress. The mutual affection between these two women from such different worlds is obvious, and it is very evident from Lady Hood's correspondence that she retained her interest in the welfare of the two children of the princess and Kirkpatrick, seen here in George Chinnery's portrait. It was the last Lord Seaforth's patronage that led to Colin's father's appointment as postmaster of Stornoway, and Colin himself owed his appointment in the East India Company in 1782 to Seaforth. Throughout his career, Colin Mackenzie seems to have maintained close contacts with members of the Seaforth family, who took pride in the achievement of their clansmen. Lord Seaforth's support must also have been instrumental in Collin's earlier appointment as Inspector of Customs in Stornoway, and it is only his favour that can explain the indulgence that would have given him leave of absence from his post in order to conduct studies on behalf of Lord Napier of Murchison, who was writing a biography of his ancestor, John Napier, the inventor of English logarithms. Collin's obvious mathematical gifts were employed to collect all available information about the knowledge possessed by the Hindus of mathematics in general and of their logarithms in particular. It was above all the lure of Oriental study that attracted him to spend the best part of his life in India. A dedicated worker, he was extremely punctilious with regard to the tiniest details, untiring in his commitment to his friends, whether officers of the Madras services, his own loyal surveyors, or his dedicated band of Madrasi collectors. He often lived practically alone in the wildest country, sometimes for 2 years at a time. He was kept going by his love for his work, to give 38 years' service in India and Java without a single break. As a prolific collector of historical inscriptions, Collin employed a number of learned Madrasi Brahmins to search out ancient writings of all languages, extending his researches to Java. The Mackenzie collection extended to 3,000 sasanams or tenures, inscribed on stone or copper, over 1,500 manuscripts in different Indian languages, 8,000 inscriptions, more than 2,500 drawings, 78 plans, 6,000 coins, and 100 images. This is a watercolour of a mosque at Seringapatam, drawn by Colonel Collin himself after the capture of the city in July 1799. And this is a sculpture of a Jain prophet, which Collin sent back in the hope that it might inspire the East India Company to give financial support for his studies of the region's art and culture. Collin also published several papers on historical and topographical subjects. His impressively cultivated kinsman, the first Earl of Cromarty, had 100 years earlier been one of the very first Europeans to display a fascination with the East. But even in the time of Collin, the Orient was a mystery to the West, Orientology being a hobby only of the eccentric. While it was normal to make a career out of the East India Company and return home to live in comfort or participate in politics on the security of a fortune made in India, Collin's mentality was such that he pursued this path out of love of learning. The consequences were of great historical value and have come to benefit our knowledge of both Orient and Occident. It has even been said that our knowledge of the literature and early history of southern India is almost entirely due to the Mackenzie manuscripts. Sadly, Collin never had sufficient leisure for a critical or literary examination of this large mass of material before dying at the age of 63 on the Hooghly River in Bengal. As his biographer W.C. Mackenzie wrote, with regard to Collin's collection, until an extensive study of its full contents is made, the greatness of Collin Mackenzie as a collector will not be realised as it deserves to be. This is the Mackenzie Mausoleum on Lewis at St Columba's in Uy, which was built by Colonel Collin's sister Mary Mackenzie in 1825 for her parents Murdo and Barbara Mackenzie, her brother Alexander, and of course her brother Collin Mackenzie. Mary herself is also buried and memorialised here. This is the epitaph at St Columba's to Alexander at the top and Collin at the bottom. Collin was born in Stornoway, but the house no longer exists. Instead, an inscription marks the site on this house. A cousin of Collins, who, as I said, attended the same school in Stornoway, was Sir Alexander Mackenzie, Canada's greatest explorer. This is Sir Thomas Lawrence's portrait of Alexander. He was known to the Native Americans as Métis Ranetian, meaning his hair is very abundant. Alexander's career showed that he too was infected with the same determined passion for discovery. He was very probably the first man to cross Canada by land, and by so doing established that the Northwest Passage did not lie south of Alaska. His cousins, Thomas Simpson and Governor Sir George Simpson, both Mackenzie of Gruinard descendants, took advantage from his pioneering efforts and followed in the search for the Northwest Passage, the latter being the friend and sponsor of Dr. John Ray, who actually found the last link in that route to the Pacific. Second in command of Ray's expedition was Hector Aeneas Mackenzie, who entered the service of the Hudson's Bay Company. It has been remarked how the lack of snobbery and high standard of education among the Scots nobility and gentry allowed their significant involvement in trade, and this sense of egalitarianism also facilitated their relations with both their own men and especially their vital Native American guides and hunters, in what were the most trying of circumstances. It was said as a tribute to Sir Alexander that he never lost a man, or forfeited a loyalty, or harmed an Indian. He was also known for his far-sightedness regarding colonial policy, and he respected and financially supported his Cree Native American wife, known as the Cat, throughout her life. Alexander's cousin, the Honourable Roderick Mackenzie, was also noted as being remarkable for not abandoning his Native American wife, as was often the case with Canadian settlers. He was described by Thomas Simpson as a well-meaning, warm-hearted, but passionate and crabbit old Highlander. Hector Aeneas's father, Charles, who was proud to be the first North trader who crossed the Missouri with 4 packs of beaver in 1806, was furthermore remembered for his exceptionally enlightened view of the Missouri Native Americans, for whom his journals are filled with admiration. He later settled in Red River, and to the disgust of many of his contemporaries, argued that his native offspring should be given the same recognition as white children. Alexander, the explorer's nephew, came to be known as the Emperor or the Baron of the Canadian fur trade, while another trader, Donald Mackenzie, was famous for being feared and respected by the Native Americans and was immortalized in the writings of Washington Irving, his life being the stuff of legend and song. The historian Michael Fry writes of these explorers, "They were equally Scottish in their tenacity, bravado, and readiness to seize what pleasure they could from lives of hardship and danger. They thought little of walking 600 miles on snowshoes to pass Hogmanay with a friend, dining on roast beaver and boiled suet pudding, washed down with their favourite eggnog, rum laced with caviar." While his journals reveal an obsessive, highly strung character given to black depression, Sir Alexander Mackenzie was nonetheless a tower of strength to his team in the famous first crossing of America north of Mexico. They traversed 3,000 miles in 3 months, travelling up to 16 hours a day into the unknown. This is the maze-like network of the Mackenzie River Delta in Canada, named after the explorer. As well as being painted by Lawrence, the leading portrait painter of his day, the published journals of Alexander's adventures brought him a knighthood from George III and found their way into Napoleon's library at St Helena. In fact, the king's son, the Duke of Kent, was Sir Alexander's travelling companion in Canada in the early 1790s, and the two men maintained their close friendship when in 1808 Alexander returned to Britain. A surviving letter from the Duke to the explorer in 1819 shows that he even took advice from him on weaning his daughter, the future Queen Victoria. The story of the island of Lewis and the part the Mackenzies played in its history underline a point I have been so keen to make in my studies of the family, that they challenge the wider perception that the Highlands and Islands of Scotland were a backwater, cut off from civilization. While Lewis has sometimes been described as the edge of the world, I would argue that not only did certain people from this island play a major role at the heart of some of the most progressive activities in modern history, but it produced a number of truly remarkable individuals who deserve our admiration today, not least in these troubled and intolerant times.